And we'll get that going. Okay. And now we're recording and we're live. So we're picking up. So we've made it almost, not quite, but almost the whole way through chapter 1 of the book of Romans. Are there questions or things left over that we want to pick up from last time? Yeah, Lynn.
I've been wrestling with the 18th verse. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Are we experiencing the wrath of God because of the behavior of the world?
Because of where we find ourselves in culture right now?
Right.
I mean, so I think that's one of those big questions, at least in my mind. I've been thinking about this since you and I chatted on Sunday. And it's one of those places where I wish I had a decisive and definitive answer for you. I don't know that there is one, in part because I'm not sure any of us can fully understand the mind of God to know, okay, is this something that is this God's wrath, or is this just human circumstance that has gotten us to this point? On a personal level, I usually end up at the point of saying, I want to think more about a God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And so I tend to, when I tend to think about the stuff that's happening, I guess I tend to think about there are those times and places where things are a result of natural consequence. I do think that that is a thing. The challenging part for me is we do hear plenty of times in Scripture, especially Old Testament Scripture, where there are those stories and those moments where we hear about God's wrath. So that's the thing for me, Lynn. Can we rule it out? I don't think we can. But I don't know that we can definitively say it is, which really is a broad way of saying I'm not sure. So I don't, and I'd love for others to weigh in if you've got thoughts on that.
I do.
Yeah, Deb.
So to me, it's kind of a historical thing. Like when we're judging what happened ago, right? And saying that was the wrath of God, but we're doing it with thousands of years of historical perspective. And I think even the Bible was doing that, maybe. Like those people going through it at the time, did they know they were experiencing the wrath of God?
Well,
so maybe historically.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Historically, looking back on it, you can say it.
Yeah, I do think that there are. I mean, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, and I'm not sure I've got a good example at the moment, but I do know that there are some stories where it talks about God's wrath on a particular nation or a particular thing, and in some ways, kind of almost, not necessarily all in hindsight, but that some of that was kind of almost, kind of in real time, if you will, along the way. Some of it, yeah, maybe perhaps in hindsight, but I think that's hard to. I don't know. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I understand what you're getting at. Sometimes,
but the stories that you're referring to, was the writer writing it literally as it was happening, or is it because they look back on the event?
That is true. Most stories. I mean, if you think about most of the Old Testament, it was oral history first, right? It was kind of oral storytelling before a lot of it got written down. So there is that aspect to it, where. Yeah, where did that get attributed to, or how did that get attributed to God's wrath? Maybe that was part of the telling of the story along the way. That's a possibility. Bear with me a second. I'm going to try to turn my little speaker thing on here. Elena just brought it in, or brought it out.
Right now, we're not playing it very well.
Okay. Can you hear me pretty well? Can you hear Bill?
Yes.
You can hear Bill. Oh, perfect.
Better off that you can.
I like it when this thing works. All right, good. Say that again, Bill, if you don't mind.
Well, in response to this issue, how about self-determination? I mean, God puts us in a game, and how we play, it's up to us. Right now, we're not playing it very well.
So part of what the phrase that I would use for what Bill's talking about is it's kind of that gift, but also the curse of free will. The notion that God gives us, in some ways, God gives us enough rope to hang ourselves with if we choose to, which I think in some ways is, when you get that passage that you were talking, where where is that? Hang on a second, Lynn, because there was another part of that where it was kind of the notion of leaving them to their own devices, kind of a phrase. And you got to remember which verse that is. Oh, it was God gave them up. That was the phrase that we heard last week in 24, that God gave them up. And so to me, I think it's also the notion that God gives us free will, and what we choose to do with that is our choice. We can choose to seek to listen and to follow God's calling and God's direction. We can also choose to wander away from that. And I mean, I guess the only thing I would say, Lynn, is also that when you think about what typically happened to the Israelites when they wandered was bad things, right? I mean, yeah, the Old Testament, you get that whole cycle of they wandered, they did things that were not what God wanted them to do. And then God usually got pretty drastic and did something to get their attention and make them realize they had to rely on him to bring them back. They stayed there for a little while and seemed to do okay for a while. And then those wanderings happened and started again.
Don't you think we're wandering now?
Honestly, I think as human beings, we're wandering all the time. I mean, I think that's part of it. We are in some ways almost continually in that. We might like to look in hindsight and say, oh, the Israelites were like that. But I think as God's people, even yet today, we're constantly in that cycle of we do things and we get out of sync with God, and one way or another, God tries to kind of bring us back. And it's that constant cycle. So I do think that still happens. The harder part for me is thinking about God in terms of wrath. And it's not that that's not biblical. I think for most of us, that just becomes uncomfortable. And so we don't always like to think about that. But I also don't know that we can rule that out, that God would really go to drastic measures to try to get our attention again, like God did in the Old Testament with the Israelites.
I think sometimes we try to humanize God too much, and he's way beyond that. Agreed. And we try to humanize him. And when I hear the word wrath, I think of anger. I choose to think of it more as bad things happen, but that's part of God's plan.
Okay.
I mean, not that he's punishing us on purpose, but he has a plan.
Well, and sometimes, I mean, I typically tend to think, like you talk about natural disasters or worldly pandemic like that, I tend to think, okay, did God cause those things to happen? And for me, I tend to have more of a theology that says, no, God didn't cause them to happen in our lives, but God works in the midst of those things to gain our attention, right, and to build to further our relationship with him. But I also know that that's just me. There are other people that would.
But as part of his creation, does he not? You know, the environment and storms and the sun and the moon and all, isn't that part of his creation? Right.
So it's a question. So sometimes it gets into the question of predestination. Like, what has God preordained? You know, did God decide that Hurricane Katrina was going to happen? Did God decide that, did God determine or decide that COVID-19 and a worldly pandemic was going to happen? You know, is that something God did, or is that a result of the fact that we live in a world after the fall, post-fall, where sin exists, which means we just live in a broken world? Our world is, I mean, I think the one thing that's very clear to me is we do not live in the world in the way in which God first created it, right? God created it for us to live in the garden, you know, in this paradise, this place of perfection, and in this perfect relationship with him. And since the fall, since that original sin, our world has not been the same. And frankly, it's not a world we can get back to. We're not capable of that. That's how, when I think about the terms of why did Jesus come to begin with, it's because we had that constant cycle and looping of God trying to bring the people back to some semblance of that, which didn't work and didn't work and didn't work and didn't work. And the only way to fully, you could say break the cycle, even though I think we still find ourselves in the wandering and coming back and the wandering and coming back. But from a salvation standpoint, the only way to break that cycle and to put God's people back into a right relationship with him so that we might know and experience eternal life is Jesus. Sometimes I get to talking and then I realize, wait, how did I get there?
Well, but I think that when it comes down to it, COVID was a human choice as well.
Okay.
I mean, choices were made that were sick, whatever. To even study the virus is sick to me. To try to make it more deadly or whatever they were trying to do in this, you know.
No,
it was a human choice.
That kind of free will. I mean, yeah, you think about the people that even develop, you know, biochemical weapons or things like that. I mean, that's a choice. Do I think that's what God wants in the world? Absolutely not. I don't think God's plan for us was ever to have that kind of thing go on in our world, or even have us explore those things. I don't think that was ever God's design for us. And yet that's where as human beings we find ourselves. So some of that stuff is definitely human made. Yeah.
Well, evil wants to be in control. Satan wants to be in control. So.
Can you hear Lois?
No.
Well, I said Satan wants to be in control, and I think that's where we're at. We always have to fight him because he wants control over the Christians.
Well,
the welfare or the things that people do, you know, to kill other people, that to me is.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Lois is talking about is, you know, forces of evil, devil, Satan, however you want to language that the devil's always at work in the world vying for control. And for us to, in one way or another, choose him over God. And I think that's honestly, since original sin, since Adam and Eve, that's been the constant struggle for human beings, is making the choices that are leaning towards God instead of leaning away towards whatever else that might be, or whatever form that might take. Yeah. I mean, so Lynn, that's one of those questions for me, to be honest. I was trying to come up with like, okay, this is a really solid, good answer to your question. And the problem was, the more I wrestle with that question, the more complicated the question becomes.
What was the
Isn't
question?
it important for us to think of that question, though?
No, I totally agree. I do think it's an important question for us to continue to wrestle with at all times. So Joy asked what the question was to begin with, because the volume here wasn't as loud. I didn't have my speaker at the beginning, and it was the notion of, with all of the things that have been going on in the world, where we are right now, and the stressors, the conflict, the violence, all of the pandemic, all of those kinds of things, are they a result of God's wrath in our world, for us as his people not living up to what God would want us to do? Is that a fair restatement of the question? Yeah. Yeah, so that's the question that Lynn had.
Well, I'm sitting here looking at like 28, 29, and it kind of says that since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so obviously the Jews were walking away from God. All these evils took over. So was that God's wrath that those evils happened? And it's really no. It's because they walked away that evil and bad thoughts and bad desires and bad actions and all these things have occurred. And much like we're seeing today, 32 goes on to say that although they know God's righteous decree, I think today, because so many have walked away from church and are unchurched, they don't, as compared to the Jews back then who knew God as his people, and it was part of their culture. Our culture now is less and less of God's
presence, so they don't know the decrees and what's in God's love. So
Okay.
so these things, they just don't know what they're missing, in my mind. I don't think it's necessarily God's wrath, but it's the result of so many walking away.
The natural consequence of culture walking further away from God is kind of what you're saying.
I think.
Okay.
I mean, natural disasters happen. I don't think that's God's doing. You know, when you think about the virus, that one's a tough one.
Although theologically, like
around and measles and all these other diseases, was that God's wrath or was that God's creation that, hey, there's going to be viruses and people are going to get them, and he really doesn't.
Right. Well, and that's in my mind, that's the part of, you know, we've got this broken world since the fall that we live in, and so those things happen. That's the way I tend to look at it. But you know, I have very distinct memories of after Hurricane Katrina, and a couple of pretty prominent, you could probably say maybe a little more evangelical or fundamental pastors, well-known ones, that were, out in public saying this is God's judgment on the evil city of New Orleans. I mean, that was a little windy. You know, that was a thing that was going on, that was being said, and that is within Christianity. I guess part of what I'm saying is also that there are different takes on how we might answer that question.
But
yeah, Lynn.
In some respects, some of the reading that I have done, maybe he did send people back to him, to make people want him and need him, and realize that they can't live without him. I don't know.
And I think even if I weren't to take it the whole way that direction, that God sent, the virus to do that, I do think that God is really calling the church and calling us in the midst of it to say, look, in the midst of this, God is showing us who we can be, who we should be, and the importance of Christian community that we are maybe taking for granted or somehow lacking in our midst or in our culture. So whether I think whether God causes it or whether God doesn't cause it, I fully believe God is working in the midst of all of it to say we can to bring us back to him in one way or another. I think God works in the midst of that for sure. Yeah, Marlon.
If you look at verses 18 through 20, and particularly how it ends, it says they will have no excuse on Judgment Day.
Right.
18 and 19 are basically saying, to some degree, in a layman's term, doesn't matter whether you go to church, you know God. You know about God's creation. You have no excuse.
Right? Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that is what it says. Yeah, because 20, ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, saying that we can't always see God at work, have been understood and seen through the things that he has made, the things that God has made. Yeah, so without excuse. They are without excuse. And I also think in part that's our challenge and our goal as Christians, is to make sure that everybody is at least exposed to the good news. You know what I mean? That's part of our job and part of our responsibility as Christians, is to be able to say to people, have you heard about Jesus? That's not a very comfortable thing to do. That's the E part of the ELCA that we don't always do very well at, the evangelical part. That frankly, we need to do better at telling not only our story of faith, but telling the story about how God and how Jesus have worked in our world and in our lives. That way, yeah, everybody has a chance to experience that. Yes, Lynn?
Haven't we sort of moved away from Christ's direction to preach and bring people to him, and gone in all other directions, and so far afield that we've lost the main message that we are to bring people to Christ?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say I hope not. I know there are different takes on that, and I know things going on in the ELCA, there's a lot of different takes on some of that right now as well. I would like to think that, I mean, for us as a congregation, I would like to think that our first and most primary thing is to be a witness to Jesus Christ in the world. I mean, I do think that's where we are primarily. I think, I mean, I can't speak for all of the ELCA. I would like to think I could, to say that would always be, even if it is one of those things we sometimes take for granted or don't state it as often or as clearly as we should, I would like to think that that is always our primary thing and our primary focus. Unfortunately, I do think there are moments where maybe it's not the primary thing that gets voiced all of the time. So I agree with you there. Because I do. I think sometimes, though, the challenge of the church is sometimes figuring out, how do you make the gospel, we'll unpack this a little bit because this might not come out quite the way I want it yet. I'm thinking off the cuff, which is dangerous. But the notion of we as Christians have to figure out how to language things in a way that make the gospel relatable to our community. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. I mean, we have to figure out ways to say, okay, what does the gospel tell us about this particular thing? What does the gospel say about whatever the topic might be? That's where we get ourselves in trouble. Even in the next passage, we'll find some of that too, where there are different interpretations of how that can be lived out. But in the end, our goal should still be to proclaim Christ crucified and risen. Sometimes we get so... What's that?
We don't hear that as often as we should.
Now, so let me ask you, do we not hear that from... When you say we don't hear that as often as we should...
I don't mean in general. I mean... Okay.
Well, that's if there was a specific place you had in mind of not hearing that.
Christians all over, that hasn't become their main focus.
Well, and I think part of that is because as Christians, at least in my experience, I think Christianity spends way too much time arguing about the things that make us different instead of spending time focusing on the major thing, Christ crucified and risen, that draws us together as one. We spend way too much time talking about all of the other stuff and not enough time talking about our unity that we find in Christ Jesus. I completely agree with you there. And I would say that's true of the church, the big C Christian church, that we do that.
I think, you know, the song that we've heard since we were kids, they'll know we are Christians by our love. It's a great song, but the problem is we do great things. We do acts of love, but we don't proclaim Jesus as the reason for it. So people see these nice things, but they can't, you know, they don't know Jesus. They don't know that we're doing it in the name of Jesus. Well, so, you know, it's.
And how many of you, we all probably have people that would be in this category. How many of us know someone who is not particularly religious? They might not even consider themselves to be Christian at all. And they do really good things. Yeah. You know what I mean? They do acts of service and acts that are loving. They're really wonderful people. I've known plenty of folks like that. The difference for us is, you know, if we talk about that, they'll know we are Christians by our love, by what we do. At any given point in time, we need to be willing and able to follow that up with words. And I think that's probably the piece. That's the proclaiming Christ crucified and risen that sometimes gets set on the back burner, if you will, or something like that, where, you know, we might serve. You know, I even start thinking about a thing like a second Saturday. Like, honestly, one of the things we really probably need to do on a second Saturday meal is we should have table tents that have an invitation to worship about, here's our worship times, here's a night for Bible study, here's this kind of stuff. And I think over the years there's been some hesitation to do that because they feel like that's too proselytizing or whatever you want to say to the group that comes to eat. As I look at it, I think of it just as good evangelism. It's good invitation. And that's not to pick on that one. I think there are plenty of ways in which we don't always follow up our ministry and the good work that we do with the thing that invites some sort of relationship. Yeah, go ahead, Lois.
I have a friend at work, and she's Catholic, and she goes, "I'm not going to go to heaven because I drink." And I said,
I guess I'm out too then.
I said, it's easy. He already died for your sins, but she can't buy that. I said, it's simple, and it is. He already died on the cross.
And she's Catholic.
Yes.
That's interesting. I know plenty of Catholics that
that's
drink
too, but that's what I tell them.
Okay. Okay.
You're in. She didn't believe me, but she is.
What were you going to say, Lynn?
Well, to go with Lois, I mean, to me, you have the availability to be in. But if you don't accept it.
Free will still abounds.
Yeah, if you don't accept it, and if you don't realize that it's grace given to you, will you go there? I don't know. I mean, I think you have to accept it. You have to profess it. You have to believe it. You have to feel it in your heart. I mean, she may not go there because she doesn't accept it. You know what I'm saying?
Well, and Jesus said, I stand at the door and knock. He doesn't say, I stand at the door and kick it in and I'm going to enter.
Right.
You have to open the door.
Right.
But so many things have happened that makes it difficult to open the door. We've taken prayer out of school. We've taken the Bible out of school. There are opportunities when you can't bring up religion in your workplace. You can't show a picture of Jesus as an example. There are so many things like that that you can't do where you don't have the opportunity that you used to be able to have.
Now that is true. All of those things are true, which what that does for me, or what at least that says to me, is it puts more responsibility on us as individual Christians to figure out ways to make that happen, to open that door for Jesus as he's knocking in somebody else's life. Go ahead.
It has to be in private, one-on-one.
Oh, well, and I'm convinced. I mean, so there you can look at, there used to be all kinds of evangelism programs, and to be honest, I've never heard of an evangelism program that you got done doing it and everybody was like, that was amazing. Look at how many people we reached. No, most of them usually just frustrated people.
I was going to ask you, because you mentioned about Second Saturday.
Yeah.
What percentage of the people that don't belong to our congregation that come are not connected with some church somewhere?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that question, Marlon, but that would be a really interesting question.
Well, just a gut feeling, more than half, less than half.
No, I mean, so I think you're looking at a couple different populations. So I think of the people that come to Second Saturday, you're talking about, and these are ballpark kind of numbers that I'm kind of guessing at a little, but I would say a quarter to a third of the people that come to those meals are members of the congregation. But I would say probably a good 2/3 of the people that come, they are not members.
But
so
they come to another church is really what
right. So you take a third out already because they're members at Trindle. I would say you have 2/3 left, and those fall into two different groups. One is more of a group that's kind of like, there's a couple of older widows groups that come. They're really fun. You'll get one or two people that'll drive around and pick up 6 or 8 friends, and they all sit together and eat. A little different with COVID right now, but most of those groups are tied, in my estimation, and of the ones I've talked to, most of those do have a church home. What I would say, it's the other third that my bet would be, and again, this is pure guess, but my bet would be at least half of that third they don't have a church home. They don't necessarily have a relationship with God. And so to me, that's a place where if they're feeling comfortable coming into our building for a meal, why not offer them the next step of Christian hospitality to say, if this feels, if you enjoy being here for this meal, come and join us for church. See what that's like.
wouldn't you think that would happen naturally?
No.
You know, because I would be afraid, on the other hand, I won't say if you pushed it, but the more you went in that direction, they may not come at all to Second Saturday. They may be offended by it.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is I don't know that we've ever, at least in my time here, I don't think we've ever received a member simply because they have been coming to Second Saturdays. I don't know that we've ever.
That's true. And in discussions that we've had about this in the past, I know that comment has been made that there has never, or the percentage is so tiny that anyone who is a Second Saturday attendee has ever, as a result of that, joined our church, which is sad, really.
I'm gonna add Bible school to that too. We have a huge percentage that they don't belong to our church, or actually more people who come, they're connected in some way. They're a grandchild, a neighbor, or something like that, but they're not regular, they're not on our rolls. So there's actually more people who aren't members that come to our Bible school at this point. And then they might start coming, they'll try out Sunday school for like 1 or 2 weeks, and boop, you never see them again. And then next summer, they show up again.
But we are planting seeds.
Yeah, Lois just said we are planting seeds, which is true. The question for me is, how do we take that planting of a seed one step further? So especially, I mean, if you get the same student that's been coming back, or parent, I mean, I've had some over the last couple of years, especially, that I've not been in a workshop, just been doing the opening and then mainly milling around and talking with parents that are still there. Have had some great conversations with parents. The group that I find to be most interesting is we have a lot of, I would say, they end up actually being grandkids of people in the congregation who have the great grandkids that are there for VBS. But they're the folks that are marginally tied to the congregation. They're not technically members, or some of them might even be technically members, but they're there maybe once or twice a year. What I've discovered is, though, some of those people, even when they're not members, if you were to ask them where their church home was, they would tell you it was Trindle Spring, which is interesting. Because family-wise, that's where the family tie is. But I do think it still begs the question of how do we, it's challenging when you think about evangelism, because I'm with you, Marlon. If you're too pushy about it, then people are like, oh, you're just looking to get more butts in the pews, or you're just looking for more money. You know, no thanks. I still think the conversations, the one-on-one conversations, are always the best invitation. They're always the best form of evangelism. And frankly, it's always the place where it's most successful. An individual invitation. When I think about the people that we've received as members since I've been here, most of them came, and some of them came because they were Lutheran and they lived close. There are a few of those. A number of them came because they had somebody in their neighborhood that lives close that said, oh, I go to Trindle Spring, you should try it out. And lo and behold, they come, and that's part of it. But that evangelism piece is underutilized. And that's not just us. I think that's plenty of churches, but.
I think that, and I'm a prime example of this, so don't take it the wrong way. But I think that for some reason, we are afraid to, for instance, Christ was not afraid to talk and say, you are doing something wrong. This is sinful, change your ways. And I welcome you with my love and my forgiveness. We somehow feel that we're going, by sharing God's love, we're going to offend someone. Is that, I mean,
we live in a world right now where it seems like anybody can be offended by almost anything.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the world in which we live right now. You can't say, it's hard to say anything without somebody taking offense. It is. It absolutely is. So I think that takes a couple of aspects to it. When you tell people about God's love, they could take offense because there's a number of different ways they can take it, whether they take offense at it for a number of different reasons, or whether I think the other reason we don't do it is we're sometimes scared that they might take us up on it. And then what do we do? You know what I mean? I know for me, if I invite somebody to church, I want people in church to be on their best behavior and put their best foot forward, because I want the person that I'm inviting to have a good experience and feel the same way about church that I do. And that's scary when you bring somebody to church wondering whether they're going to have that same reaction, that same feeling. Yeah. You were going to say something, weren't you, Joanna? It looked like it.
Yeah. Couple things. One is, I think that the listening to the key is a conversation at church on someone that you meet there is nice. It's good. It's a start. But the fruit is really borne out when you have, as you were talking about, the neighbors who talked. You know, there's a connection there, and there probably was more than just oh, come, you know, and then we'll leave the rest up to God or somebody else, you know, you or whatever happens, where there's a follow-up, and almost it's like building an expectation there. You know, you have other things in common, you talk about it, you bring it in, and then there's support for that new person there. So I think that that's another piece that we often miss, is that support for that person who is tender-footed and a little bit hesitant. And then we're hesitant, and everybody sits there kind of, you know, whatever. Which I think, you know, is one of the reasons why some of those mega churches with their small groups, where the people really get to know each other and build bonds, are so successful in bringing people in.
Well, because those small groups are, I mean, relationship is of the utmost important. In some ways, it's more important than anything else they do. And so even those invitations that are most successful to church, that in evangelism, they don't necessarily start with the gospel. They start with a relationship, and eventually the gospel enters in once you have that relationship and trust. Yeah, that kind of invitation is always more effective. Yeah, that's a good point.
And taking that a little bit further, I was thinking about the fact that, you know, we were talking about we have a responsibility not just to say we're Trindle Spring Church and so we're doing this, or, you know, this was done by whatever, but we did this because we know our Savior died, you know, put it out there in ways other than the name of the church, which I think a lot of people do. Whole bodies of churches do that, and they get known for certain things, but that really shouldn't be the message we want to get out there.
Yeah, it's the name recognition, but not the follow-up of why we do it to begin with.
Yeah, it's not about us.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I think we have to remind ourselves of all the time. I mean, that's the piece from last week when it talked about, you know, we worship the creature and not the creator, that we had last week. I mean, that's kind of that. It's do we pay most attention to what we're doing, or do we pay most attention to why we're doing it?
Yeah.
Which is significant. Yeah. Okay. Well, Lynn, thank you for asking the question. I know that's taken a couple of different directions and turns, but I do think it's worth keeping in our minds at all times, because whether we think about it as something that God is doing, we have to acknowledge that God is in the midst of it. And what is God trying to teach us in the midst of this right now? And that's what I think is important, because I do think that the church is uniquely gifted. The church is built on relationships with one another and relationships with God. And so in my mind, we are the perfect place for kind of post-COVID, for people who are longing for that personal relationship again. We're the perfect place. We're perfectly equipped to fill that void and that need to connect people with one another and connect people with God. We just have to, in some ways, find ways to best step into that. It's not even a new role, but best ways to live that out again. Yeah. Well, let's venture in. We'll see if we can finish up chapter 1 tonight. Or at least start the conversation. Well, we got to about this point last week, and I'm like, I don't know if I want to get into this whole conversation tonight. But let's, would someone read 26 through 32 for us?
Oh, I guess I will, since no one else will.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them.
All right.
The 70s.
The 70s. Joy just said the 70s.
Free love.
Okay. Well, and some of the things you hear about in the midst of that, yeah, it's not a new thing, right? It's not a new thing in some of those ways. So this is one of the places when we hear about homosexuality in the Bible. The word's not necessarily used. And it is one of those topics that gets very, very touchy. It gets very sensitive. And people have very adamant feelings, sometimes one way or the other, about the topic. And so I wanted to just lay a couple of things out there, because in the New Testament, this is about the only time that we actually hear about that. It's the only time we really hear about homosexuality at all. And so just to throw a couple things out there, there are a couple of verses where it really seems like it's very, very clear. There are a couple of places in Scripture where the meanings are a little less certain, where sometimes the conversation is a little bit more about rape or a little more about incest than it is about actually homosexuality. This one is not one of those cases in the book of Romans. I will say, as I've been trying to do some reading and some looking, especially this week, just in preparation. Hang on one second. Thanks, honey. I didn't really need it at the moment. But I was trying to do some looking and research to say, because I've also heard a number of places where over time the verses have been shifted and modified to say certain things. So I was trying to look at some of that. Verses 26 and 27, those are the verses I think that are the most challenging, the most difficult for us to hear. Some of it, again, we went to last week and we were talking about the they, when they talk about they in a bunch of these passages and who they're talking about. And we said last week we're talking about humanity a lot in general. But in 26 and 27, there are scholars that will actually say what's really being talked about here is actually more about pedophilia, like the men with men. There was in Rome, there were a lot of practices that were not what we would think of as being Christian or good practices. And so there is the notion of it being about pedophilia, about an adult taking advantage of a youth. There's others that would talk about this in the realm of same-sex prostitution. Even the notion of, part of the question is, what is the issue with it? So, is what is perverse, is it the act itself, or is it acting in a way that is not you? One of the challenges for me when it comes to this topic and this conversation of homosexuality is to say, what reference did Paul have for anything like that? When it came to homosexuality in that day and age, it was only an act. And it was to be considered an entirely unnatural act. And so it was a matter of going away from who you were to be something different. Paul didn't have in his realm of thinking that there might be able to be homosexual relationships that actually were loving partnerships the way that heterosexual ones were. And then there's, and of course there is also the take on this that just says this is a clear denouncement of homosexuality in general. So the reason I throw that out there is I think there are a number of ways you can look at this passage, or that people have looked at this passage to say, this is what I think it says. What are your thoughts?
It's a sin, but we all sin. It is a sin, but we all sin.
Okay. Well, and I do think, you know, kind of like we were talking, oh, my screen got dark. Kind of like we were talking before, is it the way God created the world to be? And this is one of the other takes on, I would say, talk about homosexuality in general. Do I think that that is the way that God created the world to be in the garden in the first place? Probably not. I don't think so. But like some other ways, the world has become, when sin entered into the world, things became broken and things became imperfect. And so the challenging part for me is we get to the point where, you know, in a couple of places, like when we get to the beginning of verse 2 and it talks about judgment and not judging, or not verse 2, chapter 2. When we talk about homosexuality, it really very quickly gets to a place of judging in one way or another, and that can be really hard to do. Yeah, I mean, other thoughts, or where do you want to go with this?
I think one of the most interesting things about it is what he does after verse, I'm having trouble seeing my verses here. I think it's 28 on, where he goes on to list all of the other sins. And he's sort of been talking about homosexuality, and it's the first one. But then, I mean, he gets all the way down to gossiping and disobedience to your parents. And to me, what that's inferring, as Lynn said, is, yes, it's a sin, but it's no more of a sin in God's eyes than any of these other things. They are all sinful. And all of us are guilty of them, not just people who engage in homosexual acts. And I think that, I don't know whether it's cultural or what it is, that we have taken that one aspect and put it up on a pedestal somewhere as a sin, you know, hierarchy of sins kind of thing. But to me, that's what really stood out about this was, you know, that in God's eyes, it's like any other sin.
And I think in a lot of ways, Joanna, that your take on this and what you were just saying, I think that bears out when you look at the very first verse of chapter 2. Therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others. You know, it's kind of saying all of these things, we all do some of them. You know what I mean? It is kind of the notion of what Forrest was saying earlier. There's no excuses. We have no excuses for not acknowledging God. And that's, like, in some ways, I think the main sin, at least in my mind, the main sin in this whole thing is verse 28. And since they did not see fit, although Lynn, your version was, what did your version say in 28, Lynn? It was interesting.
Since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God.
Well, yeah.
Over to a depraved mind.
The knowledge of God not being worthwhile to hold on to. I mean, that's interesting phrasing. Because this one says, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God.
Yeah.
Knowledge meaning is godliness.
Right. It almost seems like because the people gave up acknowledging God, God gave up on them. Kind of
well,
thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what we had. Like, as we talked about, God kind of said, hand you over to your own devices. I mean, that was part of what happened. And I think Paul also uses that in some ways to build that argument to say, none of you are better than another. None of you have an excuse. You all want to judge the other for something, but you're all guilty of something. It's all sin. You know, to me, that kind of plays. I liked what you were saying, Joanna. That resonated with me, the way you formed that.
Yeah, well, that's what it's in chapter 2.
Say that again, Marlon.
That you are just as bad.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, when that's typical Paul. In many ways, he does it a little differently, maybe in this particular book of the Bible, but Paul always likes to do that, where he kind of gets people agreeing about something, and then he turns it around and says, and that's you, right? And you're guilty of that, and you fall into that too. You're not excluded from that. Yeah.
I kind of like to take it back to the 10 Commandments.
Okay.
I don't remember one that said, thou shalt not have a homosexual relationship. When Paul's writing about this, you know, some of these things in verse 29, you know, murder, there is a commandment for that. So to me, that's cut and dry, right? We don't murder because God handed a tablet to Moses and said, don't do this. You know, there's 10 big things. This is, you know, these are the biggies. This is what you should do. And then what I feel like Paul's doing is kind of interpreting things in what was going on in his world at the time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, those are all of those things that he mentions. I mean, those are things going on, and I would say not things just going on in Rome, but there's certainly things going on in the, you know, the hustle and bustle, the metropolis that was Rome at the time. You know, and when you talk about the 10 Commandments, Deb, like confirmation, well, even not just confirmation, but people put you can put the 10 Commandments in two nice, neat categories, right? And that's what Jesus does. When he's posed the question, what is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the first 3 fall under that category, and the last 7 fall under loving your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. You know, hang on, Len. Forrest first, and then we'll come back to you.
As I'm reading this, kind of echoing what Joanne was saying, was that the homosexuality is just one of the sins of many, just the same as envy, murder, strife, deceit, etc. But keep looking back up at 27, and it says, men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. I wonder if that was the sicknesses that they were getting because they were. Yeah, I don't. Because I think back then, I seem to recall in history that there were some. I'm not sure. Yeah, and that he might have been saying, because you got these diseases now, that's the penalty, you know, that you've got for this lifestyle.
Okay.
While, you know, it's not only a sin, but it's also, you got this, you know, diseases.
Go ahead, Lynn.
I try to remember that God does not love the sin. He loves the sinner. And when we elevate a particular sin as becoming more and more acceptable, that's not what God wants. He doesn't want any sin to be acceptable. He wants the person, he wants to accept the person, not their sin.
Yeah, so the challenging part when it comes to something like homosexuality is the notion of, you know, there's the whole nature versus nurture kind of a thing. Is it people that will say, is it a choice, or is it who, you know, most people that I know that are gay, they would tell you, this is just who I was created to be. This is who I am. And
I think that you need to love them and accept them, but I don't think you need to say your sin is okay. Do you know what I'm saying?
My
sin is not okay either.
No, I get what you're saying. My question that I think we sometimes have to wrestle with is to say, is it a sin? I mean, I guess that's where I find myself, and I know that there are people that would be on opposing ends of that conversation as far as how they answer that, you know. But so for me, it's the question of saying, if someone is living a life as the person they were created to be, if that's how God created them, is that a sin? You know, one of the takes that I read that was interesting on the topic as I was doing some research said, you know, one of the things that was probably considered to be sinful about this, was men and women being something they were not created to be. It was being, you know, a relationship that was not the way they were created to be. The question, as we think about even kind of the science, if you will, of the brain, and someone who is born as gay, a natural relation for them would be with someone of the same gender. So what does that mean? Does that mean, if that's a natural thing for them, is that a sin or is it not? And again, I know that's a place where people would answer differently, but.
Could it be natural for me to be an adulteress? Could it be natural for me to be a murderer? Could it be natural for me to do any of these sins? I don't know.
But you can argue, you can take any of the 10 commandments and you can take it to an ultimate. You know, literally, if I kill a spider in my house, am I a murderer? You can take it to a really ridiculous limit. My point is that I don't sit in judgment of, that's not my job. That's God's job. I'm not saying to what degree on the shade of black and white and gray in between. That's God's job to judge.
Right.
So I love the sinner. I am one. I'm very grateful for his grace.
Right.
And it's not my job to judge it. And I don't call the shot. I don't call the shot and say they're the sinner. That's God's job, not mine.
Well, we're all sinners, so.
Right. Well,
but I'm not saying that act, what they're doing, that's God's job to deem it as the sin, not mine.
The challenging part of this kind of conversation is to say, you know, as Christians, there are places and times where we also have a need to hold one another accountable. What does that look like when we are in the topic of homosexuality? And that's where you get to, I think, the differences of opinions in saying, because if we truly see that as an entirely sinful way of life, that, I mean, that's, I'll be honest with you, I think that's how plenty of people who are gay, lesbian, transgender, whatever, I think that's how so many of those people over the years have been hurt by the church, because there was this whole sense of you are an abomination and not what God created you to be. And that's, I mean, when you think about the suicide rates of people who are homosexual versus heterosexual, there's a huge difference in suicide rate in the midst of that too. So it's really challenging to be able to say, in the face of sin and things going on, how do we hold one another accountable for things we need to hold one another accountable? And when it comes to the conversation of homosexuality, what does that mean and what does that look like? I'll tell you what, I want to give people, go ahead, Joanna. We'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I wanted to just respond when you asked the question about, so if it's a loving relationship and they were born that way. But we were all born into sin. So by nature, everything we do is sinful. So we have then a responsibility in our lives to live in the world in which we are, to try to, better things with where we are, but we have to acknowledge the fact that we were born in sin. We were born as an abomination to creation after the fall. And I just throw out, there's a lot of science that says that alcoholism is an inherited trait. So we don't give them a pass. There are things that say that, there are addictions to other things that are inherited traits. We don't give them a pass. So this falls, homosexuality is a relationship kind of thing, which tends to make us look at it a little differently. But I think sometimes we forget that if we want to look at things equally, it's all sinful. And to say it's not a sin, to me is not, I don't understand how we could say that.
Okay. Well, I want to honor people's time this evening, but I think this conversation is worth picking up. Tonight, I think, was a good start to the conversation. What I would say is if you have some more either questions, comments, thoughts, give it a week to simmer. If I do, I'm going to have to write them down, or I won't remember them until next week anyway. But yeah, write those down. We'll bring them next week. But thank you. Tonight was some wonderful conversation. Some really good conversation. I appreciate that. And our group is growing a little too, I think, which is nice. So do let other folks know that the Bible study continues. And even if they've missed the first chapter, it's really okay. They can join us for the rest of it. So as we close with prayer, are there prayer requests for tonight?
I think, again, just the Paulus family.
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything new today. Has anybody heard anything new on that one today? Tell you what, before we do the prayer, I'm actually going to turn off the recording, I think.